This is Expand Your Range for Coaches, an introduction to the 4 essential movement patterns. And I am really excited to have you here and share this material with you. Just going to start with a little bit of introduction to me, then a little bit of introduction about the movement patterns. This is going to be a really high-level overview because I've only got an hour and I've been working with this material for 15 years now, so I've got a lot to say. So one of the things I will talk about is how else, if you want to go deeper with the material, you might be able to. But for now, just a little bit about me. My background, I started with an undergraduate degree in neuroscience and theater. And then I went on to practice law. And then I was fed up practicing law and got back into sort of self-expression and psychology and found myself in a training program for a creative and performance arts-based form of mind, body, spirit integration called interplay. And that's where I met the movement patterns. And so we'll talk about that in a little bit. And interplay became the foundation for my coaching business. I started working with artists and working with them really on 3 different things. One, creative blocks and the fear that comes up when you're trying to create courageous, authentic, new work. And then the business building elements of trying to make money from art and the vulnerability that shows up when you put your work, your whole heart and yourself into your work, and then you try and sell it. And then the other thing that comes up a lot for artists is how to be in relationship with the people in their lives in a creative and authentic way that supports the courageous work that they're doing. So working with artists in those 3 areas, started getting referrals independently in those different realms for people who were applying those issues in all sorts of other areas in their lives. Now I primarily work with people who are starting businesses that they feel passionate about, mostly small service-based entrepreneurs, people who are trying to create leadership in their own careers and trying to figure out whether that means they have to go off on their own or whether they can stay as a salaried employee. The courageous living in relationship and authentic relationships, whether it's with a partner or a business relationship or with kids or advocacy for special needs kids in school settings, those important relationships showing up with courage. And then finally, I've been working recently with coaches, building the courage to go out and sell themselves courageously and building their strength and courageousness with their clients. So that's me in a nutshell. The 4 movement patterns have been foundational to my work. As I mentioned earlier, I've been working with them for 15 years now, and I met them during my interplay training. And basically, the 4 movement patterns were identified in the 1930s by a physiologist. And if you think of a movement, any movement like bending your elbow, there are 2 muscles that have to interact, 2 muscle groups. This group here, if you're going to bend your elbow, has to contract to pull it in. But this muscle group here also has to release so that it's not pulling against the muscle. And what was discovered by Judith Rathbone at Columbia in the 1930s is that there are actually 4 different patterns of neuronal firing that happen when we're trying to make that movement. One is that if we're trying to bend, one is that this part, which is sort of a brake, fires first and releases. And then this is able to contract. One is that this piece fires first and contracts, and then the one underneath releases. And then there are two different ways that they fire together, because they can fire together and the contraction can be more intense, or they can fire together and that the release can have more energy and power to it. And in the 1930s, these were identified. In the 1960s, they were verified with some electrical testing that actually tested the firing of the neurons and what was going on in the synapses. And in the 70s, particularly a dancer by the name of Betsy Weitzig started seeing how these patterns of muscle firing actually were reflected in behavior and not just in movement style. So the kind of funny thing about our bodies is if we actively engage a muscle during one of these, or a pair of muscles in these styles, we might engage our arm that way and bending our elbow that way, but actually our whole body shifts into working that way. And so as a choreographer, this was fascinating to Betsy because it meant that she could create different styles of dance by getting her dancers to move in these different ways. And then she started seeing that she'd get the dancers moving in these different ways. They'd start behaving differently in the rehearsal. And she put together the mapping, understanding that the body movement was actually influencing the way people were showing up and behaving. That's about the time Interplay started working with Betsy's work. And in the Interplay work, we've been playing with comfort in all the different ways of moving and using them as personal self-expression and growth. Recently, a woman by the name of Ginny Whitelaw has been applying Betsy's insights into corporate leadership development, and she has brought a real rigor to assessment that is required by the corporate leadership market, and has developed a validated assessment tool that looks at both where your comfortable natural strengths are in using these different ways of moving, and also whether you're applying them at work in the most effective ways. So I am trained both in the Interplay work and in giving the assessment that Ginny Whitelaw developed. So I come from both of those places, and it shows up in how I use the work. So the really, really cool thing that both Betsy and Ginny have identified is that although we have preferences about how we use these movement patterns, we're not locked into them. And so we can actually expand our flexibility and our capacity behaviorally by expanding the way that we move with these patterns. So what I want to start really by doing here is just introducing you to the movement patterns. I use two different sets of vocabulary for talking about them because I use the Interplay Betsy Weitzig language and I use the language from Ginny Whitelaw, and then I play around with it myself. So I'm going to introduce you to the way I use the language so that if you see this material in other places, you recognize it. So the first movement pattern is the one where the break fires first. So the piece that's resistive fires first. And this is a driving, thrusting kind of way of moving. It's directed. It's very directed, linear, so that there's this piece that's pulling back as you're going forward. So I invite you, wherever you are, if you've got a chance, to sort of tap or cut with your hands to feel that thrusting, driving forward linear motion in your body. And this is a motion you can do small, like I'm doing now, or you can do big. One of the images that I like to use with my clients is if we've got paint or light in the palms of our hands and we throw it on the walls. That throwing motion is a thrusting, driving motion. And that's really useful when you need to get things done. People who drive through life are the people who are always task-oriented, always going for the bottom line, always getting things done. So that's the thrusting energy, linear, forward moving. Then if the two muscles fire at the same time, but there's still more of that break, it's a little more shape oriented. And this boxing kind of motion is the one that I like to use to center it in my body. It's where you create shapes. You move forward and hold. And this is great when it shows up behaviorally. This is the put together your spreadsheet, make your agenda, let's get our calendar sorted, linear, build the system kind of movement. So I just invite you right now, wherever you are, to just make some shapes with your body. And once again, this can be small or it can be big. So if you think of a yoga class where you take the shape and you hold it, the actual taking the shape requires getting this motion, this shaping. So this is shaping or organizing way of being. The third pattern is if the engine moves first, moves more strongly, sort of the moving forward, contracting muscle engages first, and the other muscle, pause. The engaging, contracting muscle moves with more strength, but they move at the same time. And this ends up getting us creating actually a sort of swinging motion. And this is the collaborative energy. I come through center, through myself, out to meet another person, back through center, out to meet another person. This is great for teamwork. This is great if you're partnering with somebody. It's excellent for connection. You can get stuck here though, if you need to go somewhere further down the line. So you might need a little thrust energy sometimes if you're staying in this dance. But there's also real power in this dance. And the fourth movement pattern is what Ginny Whitelaw calls visionary, and Betsy Whitesig calls hang. And it's a sort of slow, smooth movement. This is where the release happens before the break. And it's like floating in water, not being very linear. If my fingers were a butterfly and it was hopping between flowers, looking for nectar, it's this place of open possibility. You could go anywhere. And this is the energy that shows up when you're visioning, hanging out, laying back and chilling to just see what happens. This is a really intuitive place of possibility. What might happen? What's out there? So The theory about these movement patterns is that although we naturally get into grooves with them, and there's been some studies that have been done mostly in the 1970s and 80s about how typical patterns of child development go through phases of becoming more or less comfortable with these movement patterns. It's really kind of fascinating. The toddler's all about the thrust. And we sort of have a tendency to get stuck in them. And so part of working with the movement patterns is identifying where we're skilled. And I use the language of skilled because it's easy to go, oh, I'm a thruster. I thrust all the time. And to type ourselves and put ourselves in a little box. There's the shaping energy, putting ourselves in a little box. But the truth is, we're not fixed. Anybody who's ever learned a physical activity knows that we can change what our body is physically capable of doing and what we're physically comfortable doing. And there have been studies done that actually show that if we change what we do physically, it has an impact in how we show up behaviorally. So the specific studies on these movement patterns are few, but they are consistent with the studies of long-term meditators who actually generate more compassion, with the studies of how yoga practice turns into behavioral changes in the world that are related to leaning into tension, the way that you lean into tension when you're actually stretching into a pose. So I'm a neuroscientist by undergraduate training. I haven't done the graduate work, but I'm really wary of making big, bold statements about what the neuroscience says, because most of what's out there is overstating what the scientists have actually established. But the research does show that there are changes we can document, and that it appears to be causal, that we can change our practice, physical practice, and change our behavior, and not just the other way around. And in fact, the experience of the people who've been working with these patterns is that we can have deeper impact working directly through the body than we have working through talking about it and working on the behavioral change, because there's a way our body knows and leads that's just faster than when it has to go through cognitive processing. So I am going to put a link in the chat box in just a little bit that talks about the assessment tool that Jenny Whitelaw and her team developed, and the things that they've shown. And it actually talks a little bit about some of these scientific pieces. But what I really want to talk to is, I've seen it work. And I really want to talk about how to use these tools as a way of developing ourselves as coaches and helping our clients. So the goal, as far as I'm concerned, of cultivating awareness of these movement practices is to generate ease around using all the different movement patterns, increasing our skill and comfort in each of these ways of being in the world, cultivating an awareness of when to use them, and then developing skill at switching from one to the other when we're using one that doesn't serve us the strongest. So for instance, if we're trying to put together a meeting and the meeting's agenda is to figure out how to respond to something that's changed in the market, for instance, we could thrust right through it. And we could put together a timeline. We could organize a little timeline that's, here's what we're going to discuss in this meeting. And then we're going to take these steps. It's quite possible, however, that what's actually called for in that moment is stepping back, seeing the big picture, and asking what we really want to do in the circumstance. And so actually in that meeting, it might make sense to actually plan the meeting with some hang energy, to do some visioning, to not go straight to action. And the wonder of these movement patterns is we can actually cognitively go, okay, I want more visioning in this planning process. And actually, before the meeting, spend some time with our hands, actually doing a little hang movement. And then going into the meeting from that place. And we've got our body shifted into that place. And then the way that we show up in the meeting will be about vision and not about let's drive through this as fast as we possibly can. And we can develop facility with that, with practicing. So maybe you've got a client who's not good at getting things done. Who's really good at being like, I'm dreaming so big, but not good at getting things done. So you can come up with a homework assignment for them, or they can come up with a homework assignment for themselves that is about how do we just physically doing this moment. It doesn't have to be about getting anything specific done, just cultivating the action-oriented, thrusting way of being in the world. So I use this material 3 different ways in my coaching practice. And I just talked about one of them. When I've got a client who could really do with one of these energies that they're not manifesting in their lives, we come up with physical practices that they can do. So they don't have to think about it. They can just physically cultivate the way of being in the world. And then they get to notice what shifts in how I get things done. If I've spent the day thrusting a couple of times before every meal, or whatever it is that we come up with as a practice. That's one way. One other way that I use it is I use it for myself, personally, to grow myself as a coach. I want full access to all of these movement patterns. I want to be able to respond in the moment to what my client needs, moving the session forward fast, hanging out and playing with what it is that they want and what wants to happen in the moment, dancing with them, or shaping plans. And so I have a personal practice of actually playing with all 4 of these movements several times a week, just to increase my ease with all of these ways of being. And I can honestly say that I have seen the difference in my ability. In particular for me, when I started working with this material, the swing energy was very, very hard for me to find comfort in. I would find myself thrusting around center and not swinging through center. And sure enough, when I was in relationship with other people, I wasn't paying any attention to who I was. I was just thrusting into what I thought needed to be done. And as I started swinging through center, I slowly started connecting back to myself between interactions with people. So I use it as a personal practice because I want to be able to serve my clients with whichever of those movement patterns is going to serve them. I don't want to be stuck in, we're always thrusting towards action. Because if what they need is to sit back and just feel what they're feeling right now and let that pass through them so that they can then, from a clean space, figure out what it is they want to do. I got to be able to hang back with them. Just be in that visionary, hang, chill space. And then if they shift, I need to be able to shift with them. So I also have a practice that involves shifting from one space to the other. Because you can't, it's really, really hard to hang with one part of your body and thrust with the other. The thrust energy ends up in this hand as soon as I start it. So there's actually a practice of, I'm going to swing and thrust and swing and thrust to increase flexibility in changing between them. So I use the material as homework development tools and as personal growth piece. And then there's some explicit ways that I use the movement patterns as a metaphor for behavioral change when I'm talking about the challenges that my clients are facing. The first way I do that is in terms of thinking about the parts of ourselves. The part of ourself that is full of negative self-talk, the part of ourself that knows what's best for us, the part of us that is channeling our mother's voice of criticism, the voice that is saying, everything's going to be okay. All these different voices that speak within us and speak within our clients can be resources and advocates and give us wisdom in different settings. And so I have developed a practice of personifying each of these movement patterns. And so I've got an inner visionary, an inner voice of hang. I call it my surfer, who just, because the surfer sits back and chills and waits for the waves to be up. And then when the waves are up, goes. So sometimes I call on, what would my inner hanger do? And I work with my clients. What would your inner hanger do? What would your inner shaper do? How would your inner thruster approach this problem? How would your inner collaborator work with this problem? And just like you would work with any other personification of sort of internal parts of somebody, you can play with imagery, with metaphor, with creating a persona. When I first did this work with myself, because I am a dancer, my inner organizer, shaper was a choreographer. And when I needed to have more work with her, I had a picture of Martha Graham, one of my favorite choreographers, who I put on my wall as a reminder. And I have developed practices like that with many of my clients. And it helps them tap into that part of themselves that can move in that way and grow it. So inner team members, inner crew members. The other metaphor that I use a lot is I use the metaphor of if your life is a film set, and who do you want to put in the director's chair? If you put your inner hanger in the director's chair, you're going to come up with one film. If you're going to put your inner thruster, somebody else. But they're all part of your crew, and they can all be given jobs to do. So that inner voice personification can map to the behavior and movement patterns. And then the other way that I do it is if I need to reframe things, or my client needs to reframe things. They're looking at a way that's keeping them stuck, and I want to offer some ways of shifting. If you were going to thrust through this challenge, what would you do? If you were going to swing through this challenge, what would you do? What is the gift of thinking about this through the visionary movement? And part of what I really like to do with my clients when I'm in this mode is I actually make them get up and move into the movement patterns before they start answering the questions, to really tap into, let's bring that collaboration energy here. Let's bring that swing energy here. So get up and swing your hips from side to side, sway in your chair, tap into that, bring it in. Now, what is the gift of what's been activated in your body? What do you notice happening in your body now? And what does that offer to the challenge? So those really are the ways that I think about working with this material. And the most important part for me is actually keeping coming back to the body, coming back to the idea that if you move in these different ways, you actually create new experiences and new ways of being in your body. So before I go any further, I just want to go over the 4 movement patterns again. So you've got them, and then you can take them with you and just play with them and see what you notice. So the first pattern is the thruster driving forward energy. And this is the linear, cutting, chopping energy. Getting tasks done, ticking things off the list, moving forward behavior. But in terms of practice, this is where there are some martial arts that are very much in this line. Any of the martial arts where you test your prowess by breaking blocks of wood with your hand or your feet. Kickboxing, very much in this realm. Long distance running can be very much in this realm. There's a thrusting nature to this. Tap dance moves in this. So you can do just pretend tap dance with your clients or yourself to just get into this thrusting, driving energy. The second energy is the shaping energy. This is boxes, holding stillness, moving from one shape to another. There's a lot of precision here. So a yoga practice that is focused on holding shapes for long periods of time, making a new shape and holding it, making a new shape and holding it, making a new shape and holding it. Or you can just get yourself or your clients into making a new shape and holding it. Any shape. It doesn't have to be a pretty shape. In fact, there's benefit in actively trying to make ugly shapes. They're kind of interesting sometimes. Faces, great stuff. So the shaping energy. Shaping energy, kind of children's games, hopscotch, Chinese jump rope, those kind of things where you've got a form that you're following really closely. The next energy then is the collaborator swing energy. Great practice for yourself or clients who want to encourage this is to actually find a playground and sit on a child's swing and swing. That's a really easy way of not putting a lot of effort into generating that movement in your body. But you can also just do it sitting down. And you can swing the whole body, part of the body, your head. The swing, the sort of infinity movement is a really nice way of getting the collaborative feel and the swing energy into your body. And then the fourth energy is the visionary hang energy. Just taking things slow, smooth, flitting from one thing to idea, non-linear, kind of random. Doesn't have to be super slow. Sometimes hang energy happens fast, but there's a sense of always being in motion, perpetual motion, but not in any sort of linear direction. The image that I often like to use with clients who are having a hard time finding that sense of motion is if your body was a piece of seaweed and you were floating in water and the waves come and just move you. There's a sense of being moved in that hang energy rather than the directedness of the thrusting energy. So there's a quick recap of the four energies. So what to do with this now that you've got this awareness of these energy patterns? The first thing is just to play with them and to explore them and to notice what happens in your own body when you play in the four movement patterns. The first thing is to figure out, is there one of these ways that I use all the time? Is there one of these ways that feels really uncomfortable? Is there one of these that I don't even sort of really know what it is in my body? And my invitation to you, just in terms of playing with your awareness of this, is just to notice that and then to get curious about it. And then maybe the next step is to say, okay, this thing that I'm not very comfortable with, what could I do to just increase my comfort with it? What kind of practice might I want to take on to increase my personal facility with one of these energies, ways of moving in me? Another thing to notice is whether one of the behavior patterns that I've sort of talked about makes sense in some challenge that you're facing or some situation that you're facing in your life, a meeting that you're going into, a client that you're dealing with, a conversation with a family member, a task, doing the dishes, something simple that happens all the time that you can practice. If you do one of these movements to get into, say, a collaborative swing movement before doing the dishes, is that different than if you thrust for 30 seconds before doing the dishes? Is that different than if you make some shapes for 30 seconds before doing the dishes? Or if you hang and find this play, what's different? So the first thing I invite you to do is to just play with these patterns and see what you notice. See what your body wisdom tells you about these different ways of being in the world. Two caveats for that. Just be gentle. Really just be curious. There's no right or wrong about any of this stuff. It's all about capacity. I guess that's really the only caveat. The other one is the same in other language. So yeah, just play and notice. If this material resonates with you and you want a sort of deeper dive into the theoretical side of things or how to use it for yourself with a more logical, linear, sort of left brain approach to it, there is actually an assessment tool that you can use for greater understanding. It's called the Focus Energy Balance Indicator, which is a mouthful. I just call it the FEBI or the Phoebe because Focus Energy Balance Indicator doesn't actually say as much to me as I want it to. This assessment tool was developed by Ginny Whitelaw at Focus Leadership. There's some information in the chat box now, a link to a file about how it was validated and the sort of psychometric studies associated with it. It is more repeatable than the MBTI. It's pretty well validated as an assessment tool. I like this tool because it does two different things. One is that it assesses what your comfort level is with the 4 different movement patterns, just in general. And the second is there's a set of questions that are asking you specifically to rank how you use various behaviors that map to the movement patterns in an area of your life. So there's a place that looks at how you're actually using the movement patterns. So you get 2 different sets of feedback in the assessment tool. And then the people who are trained to coach, to administer the assessment tool and to coach based on the assessment tool are actually given instructions about working with this material and looking at would it serve in various areas of your life to actually increase your reliance on the things you're good at and to remember that you're good at them and to bring them forward more often, or to strengthen a weak area. You can develop both ways. And so it's possible to get the Phoebe assessment done and just get the assessment and not get any coaching about it. Focus Leadership offers that. I don't offer that because I think that the real value in this tool is learning how to work with it and figuring out how to apply it into your life. So I do one-on-one coaching with the assessment when I do this tool. So that's sort of the theoretical, analytical, understand how it applies to you piece that you could move forward on this. And the other is deeper ways of playing actually in the body with what these movement patterns are. There are ruts and grooves that our bodies get into about how we use these patterns. We might only swing at a certain speed. maybe you'll only swing slowly. What might happen if you were able to swing fast? Or maybe you only swing small. And what happens if you are able to swing widely? So breaking up those grooves, identifying those grooves is useful. There are tools and techniques and sort of games to play to work on generating quicker facility and switching back and forth between movement patterns. And then ways of playing with variations in how the patterns, how you use the patterns, actively playing. And for that, sort of ongoing group classwork can be useful. So I'm going to just bring up a couple of slides. I've got a couple of specific ways that if you wanted to work with me on this material. Oh, this is the wrong one. Hang on a second. Here we go. If you wanted to work with me, there are a couple of different ways that you could work with it. I have a private FEBI assessment and coaching package that I offer that you do the assessment, we do some coaching about it and how to apply it. And that is a $200 package that I offer. Then I have a class coming up in January that is specifically on the 4 essential movement patterns, a 6-week online class in this time slot on Thursdays, where what we will be doing is exploring these movement patterns in depth, recognizing them in our own bodies, figuring out how you might apply the patterns in your life, and then getting some specific tools for working with the patterns with clients. And for anyone who does that, I'd want to do the personal FEBI assessment as part of that process so that you have that material to work with, as well as the experiential work in your body. And the cost for that package is $350. And that you can sign up for at signalfirecoaching.com/movement-patterns-4-coaches. And I've got something fun coming up in November and December for people who want to do either of those, which is just 4 one-hour sessions that I'm offering to just get in and simply experience these movement patterns playfully in your body without getting into any of the cognitive processing about how you might use them, but just to play with them in your bodies and get the deep knowing that happens through your bodies. And so those are also as an optional piece to go with either the one-on-one assessment or the class. So I'm just going to put this slide up here, which has both of those website addresses if you want to do either of those with me.